Having finished our unit on characterization and having read a couple of works by realists, we are going to move now into modern poetry, and we're going to address one more skill in analyzing poetry. So to warm up today, through this year, I have worked with you on two different ways to analyze poetry. The first one was TPCast, and the second one was the 9 Steps to Analyzing Poetry by Mrs. Laura Randazzo. And in the feedback, and thank you for your feedback, most of you really felt an affinity towards the second approach. And I think that was because we kind of talked about it in the comments. It's because it's a little bit more laid back, even though there is really a great deal of overlap. And somebody noticed that. Somebody said this is almost one and the same. But somehow it comes off as being a little less intense. And so I did point out that TPCast is used by a lot of AP literature teachers so that it gives the students a very quick, sort of intense way to approach poetry, because the end goal is to be able to write an essay, and it's all done under the constraints of the time of the AP exam. So most of you sort of gravitated towards the 9 Steps of Analyzing Poetry. And indeed, I said that in the next couple of weeks of poetry, that you're welcome to use either of those two approaches. As Mrs. Randazzo goes through her 9 steps, she addresses structure in poetry. And that is the one last skill that I would like us to sort of hone in the end of the year as it relates to poetry. So we are going to be talking about structure in poetry and how we can use structure in poetry and our understanding that it's there to glean meaning out of the poems. So I want you to think of it like this. These are both houses. And so there are certain reliable facts about these houses. When a person goes to build a house, there are certain reliable constraints in the structure of a house. For example, they both have an entryway. They might have several, but they at least have one way into that house. They both have a roof to protect the inhabitants from the weather. They both have windows to let in light and to be able to see outside. And they both, if we were to open the door, we could pretty reliably guess that they both have a place to rest. However, outside of that, they are vastly different, these two homes. There are many differences that we could also identify. And I want you to kind of think about poems like that as well. Though they are going to all be vastly different from one another, there are certain constraints that most poets hold themselves inside of. And they write their poems under the guidelines and the structure that we can rely on as we approach poetry. We can look for certain structures. And since poets know that, since they know that their audiences are informed on the structures and the elements of poetry, they can build their poems in such a way that they can communicate meaning to us in that structure. So our learning goals are twofold. The first one is very sort of elementary. It's kind of ground level. And that is just to be able to recognize structure in poems. There are certain structures, and again, this is likely very much review for you. But then here's where we want to delve deeper. We want to use what we understand about the structure in poetry to get more meaning out of the poem. So let's look at the second learning goal. And it's really not a learning goal for today. We're setting the stage today and in the next couple of days. But ultimately, your final assessment on this will be for the second part of, and what I mean by that is the second learning goal. So let me get back there and let's read it. the student will be able to chunk the text. That's grouping it into lines that make sense. That might mean stanzas or being able to see the divisions in a sonnet, okay? That's pretty ground level. But the student will be able to also recognize shifts. You've already been doing that as you understand some of the language, some of the syntax that identifies shifts, but you're also going to be able to use the structure of poetry to see shifts, especially in sonnets that we're going to discuss in a second here. And then here's kind of that deeper operation or skill. That is that the students will be able to, I'm going to say it again, chunk the text, recognize shifts, and interpret how form informs the meaning. Do you see where we're going? We're going to use what we understand about structure to more deeply understand the meaning behind the poem. So one very reliable type of poem with a very, I keep saying this word, but I want you to really sort of own this word, reliable. We can rely on certain guidelines in structure in poetry, right? So one very reliable structure in poetry is the sonnet. In order to address the sonnet in American literature, we are going to be looking at Edna St. Vincent Millay's Sonnet 26. That can be found on page 579 in your literature book if you want to look there. But really, you do not need to look there today unless you would like to. Today, let's just talk about the elements, the structure of a sonnet. A sonnet is a 14-line poem. And so if you haven't already, that is simply something you must memorize. It will have 14 lines. That is the first sort of if you think you've come upon a sonnet, you can just quickly count 14 lines and it just might be a sonnet. You'll need to look further because it also is written in iambic pentameter. And you're about to go to a video that further explains iambic pentameter. Though again, I do acknowledge that it is likely review for you. I just want to make sure that everybody understands it. And then it has a fairly reliable rhyme scheme. And there are a couple of different types. And in the next couple days, I'd like to address both types a little bit. The English sonnet, which has this rhyme scheme, I will not address it. It's going to be addressed in that next video. And then tomorrow we'll talk further, because I don't want you to have too much in one day, about the Italian sonnet, which typically has this rhyme scheme. Okay, so I have the three elements that you will be talking about in the next video that you are to watch. And I am intentionally stopping this lecture here and sending you over to Mrs. Randazzo's short video on Shakespearean sonnets because I don't want you to have too much work in one day. I want to split this up the correct way for online learning. So you are like 8 minutes, 30 seconds in, about 9 minutes in this. The other video, I can't remember exactly, but it's pretty short in length. And after watching the two and taking notes on the two, that's where we're going to stop for today. If we were in the classroom, we would go on to talk about the Italian sonnet and then to address the one that's actually in your book. But we're taking this in bite-sized pieces in hopes that everybody stays engaged and that you really learn this information. So I'm trying to address that better as an online teacher right now, and make sure I don't give you too much in one day, but that you can digest the material at a good pace and truly come away from the end of this year having learned what you need to learn. So please head over though. That means I'm saying this to make a quick plea here that you would not skip that other video. The content is very important. Even if you feel like you know it, her explanation will give you memory cues that might help you to hold on to it past this school year and on in your life and your other educational ventures. So please do go and watch that and consider that the additional instruction and just as important. You will take notes on both, and we will meet back here tomorrow to continue considering structure in poetry. Have a good day. Thank you for listening.